When corporations will do anything to take your land, there's only one way out: fight back. Hollywood legend Willem Dafoe left the spotlight to live a quiet life on his farm. But the private corporation Westland Agritech wants his land through bribery, blackmail, and, if necessary, force. When the courts and police are under corporate control, the only way to win is to strike first. Teaming up with a washed-up lawyer, a whistleblower hacker, and an ex-military sniper, Willem uncovers a massive corruption scheme. They expose the truth to the world, setting off a chain reaction that shakes the system. But the enemy won't back down. Armed mercenaries arrive, and the corporation sends its deadliest assassin. A high-stakes chase, brutal shootouts, and one final showdown. Everything leads to a last encounter with the man who thought he was untouchable. Can they stop him before he disappears forever? A single crow soared over the sun-scorched fields, its dark silhouette slicing across the brilliant orange sky. In the sprawling meadows below, a lone figure stood with his back to the farmhouse, gazing beyond the fences where the wheat rolled out in golden waves. The late afternoon light curved around him in a warm glow that felt like summer's final embrace. Anyone driving by might think he was lost in some daydream about simpler times. But Willem Dafoe, a man with lines etched into his face like rings in an ancient oak, wasn't daydreaming. He was calculating. His land stretched from the battered picket fence near the roadside to the rocky creek at the far edge. Some might call it modest compared to the endless industrial farms dotting the county. But to Willem, it was a sanctuary. A patch of earth that carried his sweat in the soil and something else: pride. It was quiet here, far removed from the life he had left behind in Hollywood. The red carpets, the paparazzi blitz, the constant hustle for the next big role. All of that felt like a ghost story now. In the hush of the encroaching dusk, the tractor engine's distant rumble sounded like a companion he could rely on. The machine was old and finicky, but it had served him well. Much like Willem himself, it creaked and groaned, yet found a way to keep working. He adjusted his gloves, brushed off a smear of grease, and walked toward the barn. His dog, a mutt named Oscar, trotted by his side with ears perked, as if sensing something unusual in the air. On a normal evening, Willem would have rinsed the sweat from his face, fed the livestock, and settled on his porch with a battered paperback novel. But tonight, the horizon felt different. He couldn't quite name it. Maybe a subtle shift in the wind, or maybe the faint crackle of tension left over from that earlier meeting with the county zoning representative. Rumors had circulated about some big corporation buying out farmland all across the region. Whispers called them Westland Agritech. Others simply referred to them as the black-suited reapers of small farms. Willem had heard enough to piece together a threat. This corporate entity bought up land and turned it into vast, sterile operations that bled the local economy dry. Farmers who tried to hold out got battered with legal technicalities, or worse. Some folks said they used intimidation. Some said they had politicians in their pocket. And there was talk, just talk, but still, that behind all of it was a cold, silver-haired executive named Alexander Kane. The old boards of the barn door creaked as Willem pried it open. The air inside smelled of hay, oil, and horses. He exhaled slowly and began unhooking the harnesses from the day's labor. Each motion was methodical, almost meditative, but his heart was still restless. He'd spent enough time in Hollywood to recognize the stink of a power play. While the sets and scenery had changed, the script was identical. A powerful figure wanted control, and he would manipulate, coerce, or even destroy anyone in his path. He patted the flank of his chestnut mare, Harriet, and she stomped the ground in response. The horse had been skittish ever since some strangers in a sleek SUV rolled by a few days ago, stopping at the end of his driveway as if surveying the place. They hadn't approached, and Willem didn't invite them in. But he didn't need introductions to know they weren't local. This land was like an extension of his senses. The second something or someone didn't belong, he felt it. The hair on the back of his neck stood up just recalling the moment. A low rumble of distant thunder caught his ear as he finished with Harriet. Glancing out through the barn window, he saw that the sky over the hills had gone a bruised shade of purple, swollen with storm clouds. He set down the brush, pulled the barn door shut, and started toward the house. The first bolt of lightning flashed beyond the ridge, casting a ghostly silhouette of the old oak that marked the boundary with his neighbor's property. Oscar followed, his tail wagging anxiously as the wind picked up. Willem considered sleeping with one eye open tonight. Something about the charged air whispered that trouble was approaching. Inside the farmhouse, the space was rustic but comfortable. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and the furniture showed the wear of years. Tacked onto one wall were pictures of Willem during his acting years. A candid shot from a film set in Europe, a red carpet moment next to an elegant co-star, and a still from his final movie, an indie project about a haunted painter that had never seen a wide release. In each frame, the glint in Willem's eyes was the same as it was now, determined, fiercely resolute. A man who didn't back down from challenges, no matter their shape. He brewed himself a cup of coffee, strong enough to jolt a sleepy horse, and settled by the window. Rain spat against the glass in sporadic spurts. He peered outside, half expecting headlights on the long gravel drive. For a while, nothing. Just the storm announcing itself in flashes and mutters. Then, as if conjured by his own anticipation, he caught a glimpse of faint beams cutting through the dark. He rose, careful to remain hidden behind the curtain. Through the shifting patterns of rain, he saw them. A pair of headlights belonging to a large vehicle. Not just any vehicle. He could make out the blocky outline of an SUV. It idled near the old wooden gate, as though deciding whether to enter. Willem's heart thumped. He felt the adrenaline sharpen his senses, a lingering remnant of the days when he performed intense fight scenes or emotionally charged monologues. Now that energy manifested in readiness. The SUV edged closer. Lightning revealed its slick black exterior. It reminded him of a predator stalking a wounded deer. Oscar let out a low growl from the corner of the room. Willem motioned for the dog to stay. He set his coffee cup down and reached behind the worn armchair for his shotgun. He hated the idea of violence, always had, but he wasn't naive enough to face potential danger unarmed. The storm's rattle grew louder, emphasizing the tension. When the SUV finally stopped, the driver's door opened. Umbrellas popped out and 3 figures stepped onto the muddy ground. Despite the darkness, Willem could see the silhouettes of tailored coats and the muted gleam of expensive shoes. The group huddled for a moment, then began walking up the path. Their posture was almost leisurely, as if they owned the place already. That lit a spark of anger in Willem. It was one thing to come and knock like any neighbor might. It was another to show up at his farm unannounced in the middle of a storm, at an hour when no decent folk would be doing business. He placed the shotgun against his shoulder, but kept the barrel pointed at the floor. He wasn't about to become a murderer in his own living room. Through the rattling pane of glass, he watched as the 3 men paused under the porch light. One stepped forward, smoothing back silver hair that glistened with rainwater. Even without hearing his voice, Willem recognized the aura of arrogance. This had to be Alexander Kane. Willem's pulse quickened. So the rumors were true. The big man himself had come. Another fork of lightning illuminated Kane's face. There was a confidence to his features, a certainty that everything around him was already his to command. Flanking Kane were 2 men who looked like lawyers or corporate enforcers, stern, buttoned up, eyes flicking across every detail as though scanning for vulnerabilities. Before Willem could decide how to greet them, thunder boomed overhead. A pounding knock rattled the door. Oscar barked, and Willem set a hand on the dog's neck to calm him. He flicked on a lamp, casting a warm glow over the interior, then turned the knob and opened the door just enough to look out. The trio stood on his porch, dripping and stoic. Willem locked eyes with Kane, who finally spoke over the din of the rain. "Good evening, Mr. Dafoe. You've been expecting me." Willem's stare didn't falter. "I make it a point not to expect anyone at this hour, but I'm not surprised either." Kane offered a smile that never reached his eyes. "We've got business to discuss." Willem considered letting them stand there in the downpour until they got the message to leave. But a flicker of curiosity and that stubborn sense of courtesy made him step aside. "You can come in long enough to say your piece. Then I want you gone." Oscar bared his teeth softly as the men entered. Kane's eyes traveled over the modest furniture and simple decor, a fleeting hint of condescension curling his lip. The lawyer types squinted, taking in the space as if assessing its value. One of them spotted Willem's shotgun propped against the wall and paused, but Kane seemed unfazed. Willem shut the door behind them. Water dripped to the floor, creating small puddles. Lightning lit the windows once more, and for a brief second, the whole room glowed in stark whiteness. Kane turned, brushing a raindrop from his cheek. "I'm sure you know who I am," he began. Willem gave a curt nod. "Alexander Kane, Westland Agritech." Kane set his umbrella aside and unbuttoned his coat. "We've been acquiring property in this area, improving the agricultural output, modernizing equipment, creating jobs." "Crushing families," Willem interrupted. "Driving small farms under, jamming up good people in courts with fraudulent claims until they have no choice but to sell. That's your idea of improving?" Kane's polite veneer cracked for an instant. Then he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Change is never pretty, but it's necessary if we want progress. Take your place, for example. You've got potential here, but you're operating at a fraction of what this land could yield under professional management." Willem's stomach churned at the insult. "I manage just fine." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "We believe you're in violation of certain environmental guidelines. There's also a question about whether your water rights are legitimate. There's going to be an investigation, and if—" Willem silenced him with a raised hand. "That's enough. You come into my house in the middle of a storm to threaten me with your investigations? You must think I scare easy." Kane tilted his head. "We're not here to threaten you, Mr. Dafoe. We're here to offer you a chance, a generous price for your property, plus a substantial settlement to help you transition. You won't have to worry about these legal issues if you accept." A cold determination grew in Willem's chest. This wasn't just some mild pressure, they were practically spelling out the blackmail. "Not for sale." Lightning flashed again. The two lawyers exchanged looks while Kane's jaw tightened. "I see. You don't strike me as a fool, Mr. Dafoe, but I suppose sentimentality can blind even the wisest among us. Think carefully. We're not the only ones who stand to gain from a quick resolution. You'll find the county officials quite interested in hearing about your compliance record, and the bank that handles your operating loans might suddenly require new terms." Willem's hand inched toward his shotgun. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Kane's gaze flickered to the weapon. "I'll pretend I didn't notice that. I'm simply stating facts. This land belongs to you, but you operate under county and state regulations. If you won't sell willingly, we have other routes to secure what we need. Eminent domain is a powerful tool when the right pockets are filled." The sheer arrogance made Willem's skin crawl. He felt a surge of anger but forced himself to keep composure. "You're trespassing. Get out before I decide not to be so polite." Kane gave a small nod to his men. "We'll leave, but let me give you a piece of advice. Weigh your pride against the cost of losing everything. A wise man knows when to walk away." Willem stepped back, opening the door. Rain slanted in, spattering across the floorboards. The storm had intensified, each thunderclap feeling like the voice of the land itself, protesting these intruders. Kane and his entourage stepped onto the porch. Before leaving, Kane turned back, rainwater streaming down his face. "This isn't personal, Mr. Dafoe, it's business." Willem shut the door, his heart pounding. Once he heard the SUV drive off, he set the shotgun aside and pressed his back against the wall, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Oscar whined at his feet, sensing his agitation. He pushed off the wall, walked to the table, and sat down heavily, staring at the raindrops sliding down the window. They had made their move, unveiling the legal threats. He had no doubt they'd follow through. The county might cite him for all manner of trumped-up violations. The bank could freeze his accounts or call in any liens. He was a single man on a single farm up against a behemoth with lawyers and politicians in its pockets. Still, a grim smile touched his face. He'd been in the crosshairs before. Hollywood power brokers, manipulative producers. Different stage, same script. He'd learned how to stand his ground. This time, though, the stakes were higher, because it wasn't just about him. It was about the land, the people around here who looked to him as a symbol that not everyone would fold under corporate might. It was about every local farmer who might muster courage from seeing him resist. Thunder shook the windows, and he rose from his chair, heading to the back door to latch it against the wind. Lightning illuminated the stables for a fraction of a second, revealing the silhouettes of the animals inside. The farmland, his farmland, was everything he had. They thought they could buy or bully him out of it. They didn't understand that for Willem Dafoe, this land was more than property. It was the place he'd chosen to live a life of honesty and hard work, far from the superficial glitz that once chased him. Surrendering wasn't an option. He locked up the house and made sure every window was secure. The storm's fury continued, hammering the roof and walls. But he wasn't worried about the thunder and lightning. Nature's wrath was nothing compared to the cold, calculated threat of Alexander Kane. Turning off the lights, Willem let the darkness fold around him. He decided to stay awake for a while to keep watch, in case some second wave of intimidation arrived. Hours later, the storm receded, leaving behind a damp hush. The ground was soaked, puddles forming in every rut of the driveway. Willem finally let himself rest, leaning back in his armchair with his shotgun across his lap. Even in sleep, his mind churned with possibilities. He'd need a plan, a damn good one, if he was to fend off this corporate machine. His last conscious thought before surrendering to exhaustion was of an old friend he knew in Billings, a lawyer who'd once been unstoppable before whiskey and cynicism claimed his ambitions. Maybe it was time to look him up. Because if Westland Agritech was serious about forging a war, Willem Dafoe would need allies. And in Montana, alliances weren't forged in boardrooms. They were hammered out in dusty diners, local bars, and the quiet corners of county offices where small-town relationships ran deep. Morning arrived in a chorus of birdsong. After a restless night, Willem awoke stiff and bleary-eyed. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a washed-out blue. He stepped onto the porch, inhaling the fresh scent of wet earth. Mud clung to his boots as he walked out to inspect his land. The fields had withstood the downpour well, though a few fence posts looked loose. A sense of relief draped over him, knowing nature hadn't inflicted too much damage. But as he paced along the perimeter, checking each fence post, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He looked across the property line and spotted a county truck parked by the roadside. Two men were hunched over clipboards, occasionally glancing his way. Inspections, perhaps. Coincidence? He doubted it. Kane wasted no time. He took a deep breath. The fight was here, on his doorstep, and the days of quiet labor were gone. Let them come with their notices and their citations. He'd drag every piece of corruption into the light. He didn't know how exactly, but he would. Because a man who'd spent years under Hollywood's glaring spotlight learned how to navigate sharks. And these corporate suits, for all their money and influence, were still just sharks in a different pond. Oscar barked, drawing Willem's attention back to the farmhouse. A small shape approached from the driveway, a local mail carrier in a beat-up van, waving timidly. Willem made his way over. The carrier handed him a thick envelope stamped with official county seals. Willem thanked him, waited for the van to leave, then tore open the envelope. As expected, it was a formal notice of investigation into potential violations of environmental guidelines, with a hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. He scanned the text, jaw clenched. It was full of jargon, referencing alleged water contamination and unauthorized structures on farmland. Lies, every bit of it. But that wouldn't matter if the county was in Kane's pocket. The legal route would be long, messy, and expensive. His best chance lay in finding a lawyer who knew how to fight dirty. And he knew just the guy, though it would mean traveling to Billings and convincing the most cynical attorney in Montana that this was a battle worth fighting. He tossed the notice on the passenger seat of his old truck, fired up the engine, and pulled onto the highway that stretched toward Billings. The farmland rolled by in a series of gentle slopes and valleys, each dotted with homesteads that might soon face the same pressure he was now under. As the sun climbed higher, Willem tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Kane thought he could steamroll this county, but he'd never faced a man who refused to surrender, who'd stand firm regardless of personal cost. Willem could almost taste the confrontation to come. The horizon shimmered with possibilities, some grim, some bright. All he knew for certain was that he wouldn't give up. He drove in silence for the first hour, letting the hum of the truck's engine fill his head. Thoughts flickered past like the fence posts along the highway, each one a worry or suspicion about what lay ahead. The rolling countryside gradually gave way to the signs of city life. Highways that split into multiple lanes, clusters of commercial buildings, gas stations, and the looming skyline of Billings. To outsiders, it might not look like much of a city, but to Willem, whose daily view was open farmland, it felt like entering a frantic metropolis. Billboards advertised everything from attorney services to corporate agriculture solutions. Even the radio station he briefly tuned in mentioned something about a new wave of development in the area, fueling his suspicion that Westland Agritech had its tentacles in more places than he could count. He found a public parking lot near the older downtown district, the part of Billings that still held onto some grit from its railroad days. Rows of brick buildings stood stubbornly against the wave of modern glass and steel rising all around. As he walked these streets, he remembered fleeting visits in the past, a quick film premiere at the local art house theater, an autograph signing for a charity event. How different life had been then, always on the go, seldom connecting with the soil under his feet. Now every step felt heavier, purpose-driven, and he realized how the sense of fight in him had grown stronger since leaving Hollywood's illusions behind. He made his way to the scruffy building where the attorney he sought was known to hole up. The address led him to a second-floor office above a bar called O'Malley's. The bar itself exuded a stale odor of spilled beer and old cigarettes, a place that probably had stories in its walls if someone cared to listen. Willem climbed the narrow staircase, the boards creaking as though protesting his intrusion. At the top, the frosted glass window on the door bore the name Jack Calloway, ESQ, stenciled in gold letters peeling at the edges. He hesitated a moment before knocking, wondering if Jack would remember him, or if he'd even be sober enough to hold a conversation. The rumor was that Jack used to be a top-tier trial lawyer who fought corruption in big corporations and nearly toppled a mining empire once. But a series of personal setbacks and a growing taste for whiskey had dulled his once legendary edge. If anyone could face down Westland Agritech's legal army with a chance of winning, it would be Jack, provided Willem could get him to care again. He rapped on the door. A muffled voice told him to enter. Inside, the office was half lit by a single standing lamp, its shade crooked. Stacks of files and law textbooks were strewn across a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard. At that desk sat Jack Calloway, hair thinning at the crown and shoulders slumped, wearing a crumpled dress shirt that might have once been white. A half-empty bottle of bourbon kept watch beside a stack of unfiled papers. Jack looked up and squinted. "Willem Dafoe," he said, as though testing the name. "Haven't seen you since... Damn, must have been years. You came through Billings for that fundraiser or something, right?" "Something like that." Willem shut the door behind him, not bothering to sit yet. "I need your help." Jack leaned back with a skeptical snort, pushing a stack of papers aside to create a space on the desk. "Everyone who walks through that door says the same thing. What makes you special, friend?" Willem took a seat, resisting the urge to comment on the liquor on the desk. "You used to fight corporate bullies. Heard you were the best. I've got a situation with Westland Agritech." Jack's brow furrowed at the name, but he didn't show immediate enthusiasm. "Yeah, I've heard of them. They've got their hooks in half the county, if not more. So what? You want me to write a sternly worded letter?" Willem slid the county's notice of investigation from his pocket, smoothing it out on the cluttered desk. "They're trying to bury me in permits and citations. I own a small farm outside Stillwater. They want me to sell, and they're not taking no for an answer." Jack scanned the document, lips pursed. The faint smell of whiskey rose with each breath he took. "You're not the first. A bunch of folks around here have been targeted. Most end up giving in. Fighting them in court costs a fortune, and they've practically got the county commission in their pocket." Willem locked eyes with him. "I'm not most folks. I plan to fight back." A flicker of interest lit Jack's gaze. "You know, there was a time I'd have jumped at a case like this. But I'm just one guy, one drunk, broke guy, if we're being honest. Westland's got an army, lobbyists, local judges, and who knows how deep it goes." "Then I'll pay whatever it costs," Willem said, though he wasn't sure how he'd pull that off if Westland started freezing his finances. "And if we need help, we'll find it. I need a lawyer who knows how to land a punch. This isn't just about me. It's about every small farmer they intend to crush." Jack leaned forward. "You sure you want to stir that hornet's nest? Once we start, they'll come at you harder. They'll dig up every piece of dirt they can find, maybe even fabricate some. Reputation, finances, everything." Willem shrugged. "They already threatened to dig up false environmental charges. They're pulling strings at the bank, the county office. As far as I'm concerned, I'm all in. There's no backing out now." Jack sat in silence for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk. He glanced at the bourbon bottle, almost as if he was going to reach for it. But then he pushed it aside. "All right, let me see what I can do. I'm not promising miracles, but I'll start by filing a motion to dismiss any bogus suits they throw at you. Might buy us time to figure out what they're really up to. Meanwhile, you gather every bit of evidence you can that shows your compliance with regs, your financial standing, everything. If they want a legal war, we'll give them one. Relief mingled with a surge of determination in Willem's chest. Thank you, Jack. Jack offered a weak grin. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be the mother of all uphill battles. I'll draw up an engagement letter tomorrow. For now, let's consider this handshake an agreement in principle. Willem extended his hand, and they shook. He noticed the tremor in Jack's fingers, a sign of anxiety or withdrawal. He wasn't sure which. But it didn't matter. Jack Calloway was the best shot he had, and there was a flicker of the old fire in the man's eyes, a memory of who he once was. They spent the next hour outlining steps, from collecting documentation to preparing for potential injunctions. Jack insisted he'd handle the official responses, while Willem's job was to keep an eye on any further intimidation tactics from Westland. Finally, as the overhead light flickered, Willem left the office. Outside, the bar O'Malley's was in full swing, laughter and the clink of glasses drifting into the street. For a moment, Willem considered going in for a stiff drink, but he decided against it. He wanted a clear head for whatever came next. Instead, he walked back to his truck, the night air cooling the tension in his muscles. The city lights glowed softly against the dark sky. As he slid behind the wheel, a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror caught his attention. Across the street, a sleek black SUV idled at the curb, its engine running. He felt a jolt of alarm. Maybe he was being paranoid, but it was the same kind of vehicle that had visited his farm. He clicked on his headlights, and the SUV's taillights flared as it drove off into the night. He watched until it disappeared around a corner, his pulse quickening. They were probably following him, making note of where he went and who he talked to. Kane's influence reached deep, and it was no stretch to imagine he had a small army of watchers. Still, Willem started the engine and pulled away, determined not to be rattled. There was no going back now, and fear wouldn't help him. He spent that night in a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of Billings, the kind where the neon sign buzzed incessantly and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments. Before bedding down, he triple-checked the locks and stared out the window at the empty parking lot. The horizon of the city glowed faintly, a reminder of the corporate sprawl lurking just beyond. He wanted to get home, but exhaustion weighed on his eyelids. Tomorrow he'd return to the farm and begin gathering every shred of evidence to defend his land. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams of bright camera flashes merged with the thumping echo of farm machinery. He dreamed of being on a red carpet again, only to find it cut through his fields, leading to a deserted barn where Kane waited with a smug grin. Lightning from the earlier storm flashed overhead in the dream, turning into camera strobes. He woke up sweating, heart hammering as if he'd been sprinting. At dawn, he packed his things quickly and checked out, grabbing a burnt-tasting coffee from the motel's lobby. The sunrise spread pale light across the highways as he guided his truck back onto the road. Heading away from Billings felt like moving toward clarity. The farmland, the open space, those were tangible, honest. The city's corporate towers and seedy undercurrents left a film in his throat. As he drove, he passed other small farms, each one a story in progress. Some had for sale signs hammered into the mud, signaling owners who likely couldn't face the mounting pressures. Others looked abandoned entirely, windows boarded up, fields overgrown. A sense of anger mingled with sadness at the sight. This region used to thrive on independent agriculture, families passing down traditions through generations. Now, big money crept in like a disease, with suits and briefcases instead of plows. Eventually, he turned onto the familiar country road that led to his own property. In the daylight, the farm looked peaceful and resolute. But as he pulled into the driveway, he noticed a large pickup truck parked near his barn, a county emblem on the door. Two uniformed men walked around the perimeter, jotting notes on clipboards. One of them recognized Willem's approach and lifted a hand in greeting that held no warmth. Willem cut the engine and climbed out, striding over with a polite but guarded expression. "Morning. Can I help you gentlemen with something?" The older of the two, a stocky man with a thick mustache, cleared his throat. "We're with the county. We received complaints about possible soil contamination and irregular waste disposal practices. Need to take some samples." Willem's jaw tensed. "Mind if I see the official order?" The man handed over a folded paper, an official county seal at the top. It cited an anonymous tip about chemical runoff. This was exactly the kind of tactic he'd expected. Before, he might have bristled and refused. But with Jack on his side now, he wanted to play it by the book. He nodded curtly. "I'm not aware of any contamination. You're free to take your samples, but I want a copy of whatever findings you come up with." The two men looked slightly surprised he didn't protest. One mumbled something about returning the results in a few weeks, while the other resumed poking around the property. Willem silently fumed, feeling the intrusion like a trespass. He had nothing to hide, but the thought of false positives or manipulated data stoked his anger. This was how Westland operated. They chipped away at every corner until a farmer buckled under the strain. When the county employees finished and drove off, Willem took a long, slow walk around his land. He greeted Harriet in the stable, checked on the other animals, and paused at the boundary oak where the creek ran through. The water looked as clear as ever, reflecting the morning sunlight in gentle ripples. A family of ducks paddled near the bank, unconcerned about corporate battles or legal threats. He considered the steps Jack had laid out. Gather every permit, every record of water tests, every receipt for feed and fertilizer. Create an ironclad paper trail so that any fabricated claims about contamination would fall flat. They'd need expert testimonies too, someone with credentials to say there was no issue. The realization of how many resources he'd need weighed on him, but the alternative was letting men like Kane trample his rights. By midday, he was rummaging through his attic, searching for any old documents or receipts that might help. Layers of dust clung to boxes filled with relics from his Hollywood past, film scripts, clippings of magazine interviews, letters from directors. He found them mildly amusing now, reminders of a life that felt distant and surreal. Below those boxes, he uncovered more practical files, well test results, property tax records, building permits from when he first restored parts of the farmhouse. Everything was scattered, and he cursed himself for not organizing it better. But at least it was here. He spent hours sorting the paperwork on the kitchen table, stacking them into neat piles, property lines, water usage, livestock health records. The monotony was broken only by phone calls from Jack, who demanded more details. Each call ended with Jack's gruff promise to file another motion or line up another contact who might help. Despite his earlier cynicism, Jack sounded more alive with each passing hour, as though the old spark of righteous battle had been rekindled. Late in the afternoon, a knock at the door startled him. He checked out the window before opening. A neighbor, Marta, stood there with a worried expression. She lived about a mile down the road, a single mother running a small goat farm. Willem opened the door and invited her inside. "You all right?" he asked, motioning for her to sit. She removed a rain-speckled jacket. "Heard rumors," she said quietly, "that you had a run-in with some corporate suit. I've had folks snooping around my place too." He nodded, pouring her a cup of coffee. "They want to force a sale. They're trying to push me out with legal threats, probably doing the same to you." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "I don't know if I can handle it. They're already scaring away my buyers, saying my goats might be diseased. It's all lies. But the local co-op is revaluating our contract. I stand to lose everything if I can't sell my dairy." Willem felt a surge of protective anger. This was the exact strategy he had predicted. Isolate each farmer and bury them in fear. "I'm fighting them," he said simply. "Got a lawyer in Billings. We might be able to push back. You should talk to him too. The more of us who stand up, the harder it'll be for Westland to pick us off one by one." Marta's eyes glimmered with cautious hope. "I'm just afraid. Kane and his people are ruthless. I've got a kid to feed. If I lose the farm, where do I go?" He touched her shoulder gently. "I can't promise anything, but I won't stand by and let them pick us off. I'm not going anywhere. You shouldn't have to either." They spent a while discussing legal steps. Marta agreed to bring her records to Jack for review. When she finally left, Willem felt more certain than ever that he'd made the right choice. This wasn't just his fight. It was for every farmer being squeezed by a faceless corporation's greed. Night arrived with a gentle rain that coated the fields in silver droplets. Willem boiled water for tea, letting the calm patter on the roof soothe his frayed nerves. He glanced at the stacks of documents on his table. They were as much a shield now as any firearm, proof that he'd lived and worked honestly on this land. Westland could fabricate rumors all day, but he had facts on his side. He looked at Oscar, curled up near the fireplace, and wondered if the dog sensed the tension in the air. Animals were perceptive like that. In the flicker of the low light, Willem reflected on how much his life had changed. In Hollywood, battles were fought through backroom deals, PR spin, and the currency of fame. Here, the battles were tangible and raw, about clinging to the soil under your feet. He felt more alive now than he had in any scripted moment on set. His phone buzzed. Jack was calling again, his voice crackling with an edge of excitement Willem hadn't heard before. "I've got a lead," Jack said. "A possible whistleblower from inside Westland. Used to be in their real estate acquisitions. Name's Lauren Pike. She vanished about 2 years ago under suspicious circumstances. If we can find her, she might have evidence of fraud that goes deeper than we imagined." Willem listened intently. "Any idea where she is?" "Not yet. Some folks say she went off-grid, but I've got a contact in Billings who might help track her down. This could be huge. If we can prove that Westland used illegal shell companies or coerced farmers, we can blow them up in court." Willem's mind churned with possibilities. "Keep me posted. I'll be here gathering what I can. And Jack, thanks. It feels like we have a shot." "Let's not jinx it," Jack replied with a wry chuckle. "I'll be in touch." When he hung up, Willem couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. There was a sense of momentum now, a feeling that the monolithic shape of Westland Agritech might have cracks in its foundation. He stared out the window at the moonlit fields, thinking of his father's old words about resilience. The roots that run deep can't be easily torn up. This land had become part of him, its soil practically in his veins. That bond wouldn't be severed without a fierce fight. He let the evening pass in quiet contemplation, sipping tea and reviewing the documents once more. Each page told a piece of his story, from the day he'd signed the deed to every improvement he'd made. He wondered if the same corporate suits harassing him had any sense of the personal history tied to each acre. Probably not. They just saw a profit margin. But for him, it was priceless. A place where he'd found solace after escaping the swirling demands of fame. A place where he felt free to be more than a caricature on a screen. Morning light returned, and the farm awakened with gentle sounds of animals stirring and the soft rustle of wind in the crops. Willem grabbed a shovel, deciding to do some repairs on the fence posts loosened by the storm. Manual labor had a centering effect, reminding him that while lawyers and corporations clashed, daily chores still needed doing. He set to work, methodically securing each post, hammering nails, tightening wires. Sweat formed on his brow as the sun climbed, and despite the stress, he reveled in the honest effort. At midday, he paused to wipe his forehead and drink from a canteen. Glancing back toward the house, he spotted a dust plume on the road. Another visitor. He straightened, heart thudding, wondering if it was more county officials or Westland goons. But as the vehicle drew closer, he recognized an old pickup with a battered side panel. It belonged to Billy Ray, a local rancher Willem occasionally traded supplies with. Billy Ray parked near the barn and hopped out, tipping his hat in greeting. "Heard you might be in need of some fence supplies," he said, pointing to a few bundles of wire and planks in the truck bed. "Thought I'd drop 'em by, see if you was interested." Willem appreciated the gesture. "That's mighty generous of you. I could use some extra posts, too." Storm hit me harder than I thought. As they unloaded supplies, Billy Ray cast a worried look toward the horizon. "Folks are talking about Westland hitting you with lawsuits. They tried to buy out my cousin's place last year. When he refused, they somehow got the bank to foreclose on him, even though he wasn't behind on payments. He left Montana to work on an oil field in North Dakota. That's how bad it got." Willem felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "This ends here," he said, voice laced with resolve. "If I have to set up a blockade at the county courthouse, I will." Billy Ray nodded, patting Willem on the shoulder. "We're behind you. A lot of folks are. We just need someone to stand up first. You do that, you won't stand alone." Those words settled in Willem's chest like a promise he meant to keep. The conversation with Billy Ray renewed his determination. Maybe they could gather enough local resistance to make this more than one man's fight. After finishing the fence repairs, Willem walked back to the farmhouse, his muscles aching in a satisfying way. As he reached the porch, he realized the wind was shifting. It carried a subtle dryness that hinted at the changing season. Clouds hovered overhead, gray and ominous, as if another storm was brewing, though whether it was weather or fate he couldn't quite tell. He went inside, intending to check in with Jack. But before he could dial, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered cautiously, and a low, clipped voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Dafoe? This is Margaret Finch from the county clerk's office. I wanted to give you a heads up. There's a meeting tomorrow of the county board about rezoning in your area. I saw your name come up in some documents. Can't say more, or I'll lose my job. Just thought you should know." She hung up abruptly. Willem stood there, phone in hand, adrenaline coursing through him. Rezoning could mean anything, from seizing land for public good to rewriting regulations that made his farm untenable. He dialed Jack right away, explaining the cryptic call. Jack cursed under his breath. "They're ramping up. I'll drive out there first thing in the morning. We'll attend that meeting together. Bring every piece of evidence you've got about your land use, your compliance. They can't just pass some ordinance without public comment." Willem clenched the phone. "I'll be ready. Another front in the battle." Every day, Kane's tactics became more transparent. Trap him in endless bureaucratic nightmares until the cost of fighting was too high. But as he looked around at the farmland he'd come to love, at the walls that sheltered him, at the memories he'd built here, he knew he had no other choice. Pride wouldn't let him surrender. Justice wouldn't allow it either. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the coming confrontation. He sorted the files again, made notes on county codes, and even found old photographs showing the land's natural state before he'd taken over, proof that he'd improved, not harmed, the environment. His phone rang a few more times, neighbors calling to offer support or share concerns about Westland encroachments. Each conversation lit a spark of solidarity. They were tired of watching families pushed off their generational homesteads. Dusk descended on the farm with a chill breeze. Willem stood outside for a while, gazing at the darkening sky. Tomorrow would be a test, another round in this drawn-out war. But he felt a fierce calm settle over him. He was no stranger to pressure. The difference now was that the stakes were personal and vital, not just about a film's success or a career move. This was about defending a place that had given him a renewed sense of purpose. As the last light faded, Willem closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of fresh earth and faint pine on the wind. The land was resilient, just as he aimed to be. Whatever the county board and Westland Agritech threw at him, he'd confront it head-on. In the quiet gloom, he found strength in the stillness, knowing that while the path ahead was fraught with traps, he was far from alone. The network of people who believed in him, who believed in preserving what was right, grew with every day. He locked up for the night, once again placing the shotgun by his bedside. Oscar curled at his feet, both protector and companion. As he drifted to sleep, the weight of tomorrow's meeting pressed on him, but beneath that burden pulsed a determined heartbeat. This land was more than dirt and crops. It was a testament to the idea that free men and women could live on their own terms, unbowed by corporate overreach. He would stand tall, and if Kane or anyone else thought otherwise, they'd learn the hard way what it meant to face a man who refused to be broken. He woke before sunrise, finding the house oddly quiet aside from the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of livestock. The day of the county board meeting had arrived, and a kind of nervous energy coursed through him, urging him to prepare. He fixed a simple breakfast, eggs from his coop, toast, a mug of black coffee, and ate without really tasting any of it. His gaze roamed over the piles of documents arrayed on the table. Water testing records, building permits, property surveys, environmental compliance certificates, and old letters from the previous owner, each piece of paper acting as a ward against the corporate storm that threatened to engulf him. At exactly 7:30, he heard a car roll up the gravel drive. Jack Calloway stepped out, wearing what was almost a presentable suit, wrinkled in places but clearly the best he had worn in years. Gone was the half-defeated man Willem had first met in that dimly lit office. Though he still carried a tiredness around his eyes, Jack seemed focused, purposeful. As he reached the porch, Willem opened the door and offered a firm handshake. "Ready?" Willem asked, motioning Jack inside. Willem had spent half the previous night duplicating his records. They now lay in labeled folders. Jack flipped through them with a critical eye, nodding slowly. "This is good. We can demonstrate you've complied with every regulation. If they claim new violations, we'll demand immediate proof. That should stall them, at least. Meanwhile, we wait to see if your whistleblower, Lauren Pike, materializes with bigger evidence against Westland." Willem exhaled. "Feels like we're up against a loaded deck." "More like we're playing poker at a table owned by Kane," Jack said, shrugging. but were not walking in unarmed. They loaded the documents into the truck. Willem locked the farmhouse, still uneasy about leaving it unguarded, but he had no choice. The drive to the county seat took just under an hour. They kept the conversation minimal, each man lost in his own calculations. The further they traveled, the more tension built in Willem's chest, as though the roads themselves were funneling him into the heart of a confrontation he couldn't avoid. The county building was a squat, mustard-colored structure with peeling paint, erected decades ago in an era of practical, no-frills architecture. A small crowd had gathered on the front steps. Local farmers, curious residents, and a handful of men in suits whom Willem guessed were Westland representatives or county officials, indistinguishable in their dark attire and carefully manicured appearances. 2 uniformed deputies hovered near the entrance, scanning the crowd with detached alertness. Willem spotted a few familiar faces among the farmers, neighbors and acquaintances who offered nods or words of encouragement. Even Marta was there, standing with an older rancher who clutched his hat with trembling hands. A quiet resolve seemed to unite them, as if they all knew that this was bigger than a single zoning issue. Jack and Willem stepped through the glass doors and entered a lobby lined with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. The county board's meeting room lay at the end of a corridor. They walked in, took seats near the front, and laid out their files on the small table before them. The space soon filled with the murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, and the scraping of chairs as farmers, business representatives, and curious onlookers packed into every seat. The board members filed in next, 5 individuals of varying ages, each settling behind a long wooden dais. Their collective expressions ranged from bored to apprehensive, but none betrayed outright hostility. A short, bespectacled woman rapped a gavel, calling the meeting to order. She introduced herself as the board's chair, Miss Caldwell, and explained the proceedings would address local rezoning proposals, including certain updates to agricultural land use policies. Willem tried to read the board's body language. Some seemed uncomfortable, likely aware that this meeting had become a flashpoint. 1 or 2 offered polite nods in his direction. Then, off to the side, he noticed Alexander Kane himself, seated with an air of unshakable confidence. He wore a dark suit, impeccable even in this humble county setting, and he was flanked by a small cadre of attorneys. Kane caught Willem's eye and gave a slow, knowing smile. The agenda was read out. A few minor county expenses, some discussion on road maintenance, and then they arrived at the rezoning matter. Miss Caldwell cleared her throat. Next on the agenda, we have a proposal from Westland Agritech pertaining to the reclassification of certain farmland parcels for developmental purposes. This reclassification could allow for more industrial agricultural operations in the region. Jack leaned over to Willem, whispering, "They're calling it industrial operations, but that's code for bigger expansions, fewer small farms." A representative from Westland, a gray-suited man with a monotone voice, stepped to the microphone. He spoke with rehearsed politeness about modernizing the county's agricultural footprint, maximizing output, and bringing new jobs. He rattled off numbers that sounded impressive but were disconnected from the human element. When he finished, Miss Caldwell opened the floor for public comments. Jack nudged Willem. "We go up together." They approached the microphone. Jack introduced himself as legal counsel for Willem Dafoe, an independent farmer, and several other local landowners potentially affected by the proposed rezoning. He laid out a concise argument. The new classification would subject small farms to regulations favoring large-scale corporate ownership, effectively squeezing them out. Then Willem spoke, voice steady but carrying the passion of someone defending his home. "This county has been built on family-owned farms for generations," he said, scanning the room. "My neighbors and I are not opposed to progress. We want to see our land thrive. But that can't happen if we're forced out by an entity that treats farmland like a commodity to be flipped and consolidated. You've likely seen or heard of the intimidation tactics, the questionable legal maneuvers aimed at folks who won't sell. I'm asking this board to think about the legacy of this community." Kane's attorney rose, feigning a smile. "With all due respect, Mr. Dafoe's allegations are unsubstantiated. Westland Agritech follows every legal channel in acquiring property. We're here to improve the local economy, not destroy it." A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. One farmer stood up, voice quavering with indignation. "Then why was my cousin threatened with foreclosure out of nowhere? He'd never missed a payment, but after Westland reps visited, the bank called his note due. He lost everything. Kane's attorney glanced dismissively in the farmer's direction. I'm not aware of that specific situation. Another neighbor chimed in about questionable water contamination claims. More voices followed, each sharing a story or rumor of corporate pressure. The atmosphere grew tense, charged with anger and fear. The board members exchanged nervous looks, clearly unprepared for such a public display of dissent. Miss Caldwell rapped her gavel for order. We're here to discuss the proposed rezoning. Personal grievances, if relevant, should be submitted as formal complaints. Willem almost laughed at the irony. They're making it personal by targeting us one by one. The rezoning is just another strategy to undermine small farms. If the board truly wants to represent the people of this county, it should reject Westland's proposal until a thorough investigation into their practices is completed. A moment of near silence descended. Then Kane himself rose from his seat in the audience. The quiet in the room was tangible. Everyone recognized him as the force behind Westland's expansion. He walked to the microphone with a practiced calm that suggested he thrived on such confrontations. Friends, I understand these concerns, he began, his voice a silky baritone. But let's be clear. Westland's investments have already brought numerous benefits. New technology grants for local schools, better road maintenance near agricultural hubs, donations to local charities. We want to work together with your community, not against it. As for the allegations of misconduct, I've seen no credible evidence. If Mr. Dafoe and his associates have any proof, let them present it. Kane gestured toward Willem. The subtle challenge hung in the air. Produce ironclad, scandalous evidence or be dismissed as a troublemaker. Willem opened his mouth to speak, but Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. Jack turned to the board, clearing his throat. We do, in fact, have evidence of potential misconduct, but it pertains to corporate maneuvers that may not fall directly under the county's purview. That doesn't mean it isn't relevant. We request the board delay any rezoning decision until we can compile this documentation and share it with state authorities. Kane raised an eyebrow, his smile unwavering. Then by all means, proceed. Meanwhile, the county should not stall necessary development based on unsubstantiated rumors. If Mr. Dafoe and his associates want to block progress, they should do so through proper legal channels, not by impeding the county's entire economic future. Miss Caldwell, evidently flustered, fidgeted with the gavel. She called for a brief recess to let the board confer. The meeting paused, and a cacophony of voices erupted in the room, half the attendees voicing outrage at Westland, the other half uncertain or silent. Willem stepped aside with Jack, the two exchanging tense whispers. This is exactly what they want, Jack muttered. To paint us as obstructionists with no real proof. We need more than just the testimonies of your neighbors. We need a smoking gun. Willem nodded grimly. That's where Lauren Pike comes in. Any news on her whereabouts? Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. I asked a contact to do some digging. There's a rumor she's living off-grid in Wyoming or maybe near the Canadian border. No confirmed location yet. But if we find her, we might have the leverage we need. Until then, the board might still vote in Kane's favor. The recess ended, and Miss Caldwell reconvened the meeting. She announced that, given the public outcry and the many testimonies heard, the board would schedule a formal review period before finalizing any rezoning decisions. Applause broke out among the farmers, though the relief was tempered by a sense that this was just a reprieve, not a victory. The board's final statement was laden with procedural jargon indicating they might still approve Westland's proposal at a later date unless compelling evidence was produced. Outside, as the crowd spilled onto the front steps of the county building, the mood was a mixture of hope and anxiety. People shook Willem's hand, thanking him for speaking up. Marta embraced him briefly, tears in her eyes. You bought us time, she whispered. Maybe that's enough to hold on a bit longer. He nodded, comforting her as best he could. Kane emerged moments later, surrounded by his legal team. He offered Willem a small nod, somewhere between acknowledgement and condescension. You're persistent, Mr. Dafoe. I'll give you that. But persistence alone doesn't win wars. You'll need a lot more than passion to stop us. Willem met his gaze. I have truth on my side. Kane almost smirked. Then bring it, and let's see which side the law favors. With that, he strode off, his attorneys in tow, leaving behind an air of undisguised menace. Jack sighed, removing a set of documents from his briefcase and flipping through them with shaky fingers. That was better than I expected, honestly. They didn't rubber stamp his request. But we're under the gun now. If we don't come up with hard evidence soon, that rezoning's going to happen one way or another. Willem helped Jack gather up the rest of the paperwork as the last few people filtered out. Where do we even start? In the immediate sense, I'll pull some strings to see if we can get an injunction blocking further action until the review is done. Longer term, we find Pike. If she's got proof of Westland's shell companies, forced buyouts, any illegal tactics, that changes everything. They left the building and walked to the parking lot, where a light drizzle had begun to fall. Miss Caldwell stepped out onto the stoop and called after them, her voice lowered. Mr. Dafoe, Mr. Calloway, a word? They paused, letting her catch up. She glanced around nervously, as though wary of eavesdroppers. We might have records in the county archives that detail some unusual property transactions over the last few years. If you can get a court order, I'll hand them over. But my hands are tied until then. Jack's eyes brightened. We'll work on that. Thanks for the heads up. She gave a tight nod, then hurried back into the building. Willem watched her depart, wondering how many county officials were caught in the crossfire, torn between a sense of duty and the pressures from powerful corporate interests. The entire county felt like it was caught in a web of fear. On the way back to Stillwater, the conversation between Jack and Willem shifted to more practical matters. How to keep the bank from interfering, how to ensure the county's environmental inspection couldn't be falsified, and which local journalists might be sympathetic enough to shine a light on Westland's intimidation. They talked about building alliances, from local ranchers to environmental groups that typically fought corporate agriculture on ecological grounds. The scope of the fight continued to expand, but so did their resolve. As they neared Willem's farm, he noticed a strange vehicle in his driveway, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows. Alarm bells rang in his head. He parked the truck a safe distance away, scanning the area. The sedan's engine was still running. Jack tensed, rummaging for his phone, poised to call the sheriff if necessary. Then the sedan door opened, and a lone figure stepped out, arms raised in a non-threatening gesture. A woman's voice called out, "Willem Dafoe? I'm from the local news station. I'd like to talk to you." Willem exhaled, relaxing slightly. He recognized her as Amy Morales, a reporter who sometimes covered local controversies. She approached, microphone in hand, and a small camera rig behind her. "I heard about the hearing today," she said. "The buzz is that you and some neighbors are accusing Westland of strong-arm tactics. Is that on the record?" He and Jack exchanged glances. The immediate instinct was caution. Speaking to the press could be a double-edged sword. But the idea of shining public light on Westland's actions had always been part of the plan. Maybe this was an opportunity to shift the narrative. Jack nodded slowly. "We'll talk, but keep it factual. No spinning rumors as truths." Amy raised a hand. "Fair enough, I just want the story. People in this county deserve to know what's happening." They invited her onto the porch. Willem stood stiffly as she asked questions on camera. About the rezoning, the environmental claims, the intimidation. She pressed politely but firmly, seeking sound bites. Willem tried to keep his answers focused on verifiable facts, emphasizing the personal stories of farmers who'd been threatened or forced out. Jack weighed in with legal points, referencing the unscrupulous methods corporations sometimes use to break down local resistance. Midway through the interview, a truck rumbled past on the dirt road. Willem spotted the silhouette of someone craning their neck to look at them. He couldn't tell if it was a neighbor or one of Kane's watchers, but the notion of the latter gnawed at him. When the interview wrapped, Amy lowered her camera and microphone. "Thank you," she said. "This is a big deal, maybe bigger than people realize. I'll put this piece together, but fair warning, Westland's got powerful media connections. My station manager might face pressure." Jack shrugged. "Do what you can. We appreciate it." She left soon after, the sedan's taillights fading down the gravel road. A faint tension lingered in the air. Willem was aware that while media attention could help rally support, it could also provoke Kane to escalate. He pictured suits in boardrooms deciding which lever to pull next, which county official to buy off, which bank manager to pressure. Jack sighed. "I'll head back to Billings. Got a filing to prepare first thing tomorrow. If Westland tries anything else in the meantime, call me. Also, keep an eye out for suspicious vehicles. They might try to intimidate you further." Willem gripped Jack's hand. "Thanks for coming today." Jack nodded, then drove off, leaving Willem to stand on his porch as the last remnants of daylight stretched across the fields. He was exhausted, mentally and physically, but far from defeated. The day's partial success, getting the board to delay the rezoning, was more a battle won than the war. Kane's attorneys would now dissect every angle to see how best to discredit him. As night fell, he made his usual checks around the farm, ensuring the barn was locked, the horses secured, and the perimeter fence intact. Oscar trotted at his side, ears on alert. A crisp breeze drifted over the fields, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint promise of an early frost. It struck Willem how fleeting the seasons felt now, each day overshadowed by the impending clash. Inside, he found himself too keyed up to settle into his usual evening routine. He paced the living room, phone in hand, half expecting a call from one of his neighbors or from Jack. Instead, the phone remained silent. Eventually, he forced himself to sit, flipping absently through local news channels on TV. A brief segment about the county board meeting flashed on screen. His own face appeared, captured mid-sentence, while the anchor offered a shallow summary of allegations of corporate overreach. Then came a brief statement from a Westland spokesperson denying wrongdoing. The segment ended as quickly as it began. He turned off the TV, feeling that same slow burn of determination. Whatever happened in the coming days, the story was at least seeping into the public eye. The more people who learned about Westland's tactics, the less they could operate in the dark. He only hoped it would be enough to unravel the labyrinth of influence Kane had woven. Later that night, as he lay in bed with the window cracked open to let in fresh air, he replayed the board meeting in his mind. The tension, the subtle power plays, Kane's calculated remarks. He analyzed it all, trying to glean how best to strike back. One thought kept surfacing. If they could find Lauren Pike, the tide might truly turn. Her insider knowledge could expose the heart of Westland's corruption. He drifted off, thinking about the roads she might have taken, the remote corners she might hide in. When he dreamed, it was of a vast, tangled forest, each path leading to dead ends patrolled by faceless men in suits. Only one obscure trail led deeper, promising the truth, but he kept losing his way. He woke in darkness, shaken, the weight of the fight pressing down like a physical burden. Morning arrived with a stretch of golden sunlight that warmed the barn's weathered boards. He was up early, tossing hay to the horses and performing routine chores, each task an anchor to normalcy in an otherwise chaotic time. The sky was a flawless blue, a fleeting reminder of the serenity that had once filled his days. By mid-morning, the phone rang. He answered to find Jack on the other end, voice vibrating with excitement. "I've got something," he said. "My contact in Billings turned up a lead. It's possible Lauren Pike was spotted near a place called Redwater in Wyoming, a tiny town. No official record of her, but someone matching her description was renting a cabin there a few months ago." Willem found his pulse quickening. "That's the best lead we've had." "It is," Jack agreed. "We can't ignore it. We need to go see if she's still around or if anyone knows where she might have gone next." "What about the legal filings here?" Willem asked, thinking of the mountain of paperwork that still needed attention. "I've got a few days before the next hearing. I'll prep the urgent stuff tonight. We can head out tomorrow, spend a day or two investigating. If Lauren Pike has the evidence we think she does, it's worth the risk." Willem felt the tug of responsibilities at home, but the logic was clear. Without that insider testimony, they were relying on scattered allegations. "All right," he said, mind already spinning possibilities. "Let's do it." He hung up, running a hand over his beard. This was a turning point, a chance to dismantle Westland's fortress of secrecy, but it also meant leaving his farm unguarded, if only briefly. He decided to ask Marta or Billy Ray to watch over the place and keep an eye out for any intruders. They'd likely be willing, given their own stakes in this fight. Throughout the rest of the day, he made preparations for the trip. He packed clothes, a folder of important documents, and his handgun, just in case. He hated the idea of violence, yet the memory of corporate thugs showing up at his doorstep lingered. Kane would not hesitate to send his enforcers if he caught wind of them closing in on Pike. By dusk, everything was in order, and he locked the farmhouse as securely as he could. Oscar would stay behind, guarded by Marta's watchful eyes and frequent visits. In the waning light, as he loaded his truck, a sense of foreboding mingled with anticipation. He was leaving the safety of home to chase a ghost, guided mostly by rumors. Yet a small flame of hope burned within him. If they truly found Lauren Pike, And if she was willing to testify, they might finally have the weight needed to topple Westland Agritech's carefully orchestrated plans. Night settled in, calm but heavy. He climbed onto his porch roof to check the weather vane, a ritual born out of caution. The air was still, the stars sprinkled overhead, untroubled by the affairs of men. From this vantage, the farmland spread out in a vast, dark expanse, the faint outlines of fences, fields, and the gentle slope of the horizon. It struck him how easily all this could be lost if corporate greed prevailed. He would never let that happen without a fight, no matter how far he had to travel, no matter how many powerful men he had to face down. He let himself linger in the cool night air for a few more minutes, soaking in the serenity, fortifying his resolve. Tomorrow he'd drive south with Jack to Redwater. With any luck, they'd uncover something decisive. And if Kane tried to stop them, well, they'd be ready. Every piece of adversity so far had only hardened his will. Sliding back through the window into his bedroom, he settled in for a restless sleep, his mind alive with the prospect of finally finding the key to unravel Westland's empire. The hours of darkness passed too quickly, and when dawn arrived, he felt he'd barely closed his eyes. Yet he rose with purpose, fueled by a clarity that only comes to those defending something sacred. Jack arrived in a battered sedan at first light, a thermos of coffee in hand, his expression grim but resolute. They exchanged few words, throwing their bags into Willem's truck, deciding it was the more reliable vehicle for rough roads. As they pulled away from the farm, Willem allowed himself one last glance at the barn, the old oak tree, the battered fence posts, and the fields that had once been his private haven. They headed out, the two-lane highway stretching ahead like a promise of confrontation. The world felt both immense and claustrophobic, every mile punctuated by the reality that Kane's reach was long. Neither man spoke much in the first half hour, each lost in his own thoughts. The only soundtrack was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of paper as Jack flipped through files on his lap, refreshing his memory on everything they knew about Lauren Pike. As the Montana plains gave way to the more rugged contours near the state line, Willem felt the quiet burn of anticipation in his chest. He thought of the day he'd decided to leave Hollywood behind, seeking peace and anonymity. Now here he was, thrust into a high-stakes showdown with a corporate titan. Life had a way of pushing a man into battles he never asked for. Yet this time, he embraced the struggle. If Lauren Pike was out there, afraid, hiding, burdened with dangerous knowledge, he'd find her. And if that knowledge could save not just his farm, but also the livelihoods of so many neighbors, then every risk was justified. The road unspooled ahead, carrying them deeper into a landscape of possibility and danger. With each passing mile, they drew closer to the showdown that might define whether one stubborn farmer and a half-redeemed lawyer could stand against the might of Westland Agritech. And in the back of his mind, Willem couldn't help recalling Kane's final parting words at the county building. "Bring your truth, and let's see which side the law favors." He intended to do exactly that, no matter how winding or treacherous the path that led him there. They drove for hours, leaving Montana's plains behind as the road climbed and twisted into Wyoming's more rugged terrain. Conversation was sparse. Both men focused on the destination, a tiny outpost called Redwater, rumored to be Lauren Pike's last known hiding place. The truck rumbled over pitted back roads, framed by hillsides peppered with pine and scrub. Occasionally, they'd pass a cluster of weathered trailers or a faded ranch sign, and Willem Dafoe would wonder whether Westland Agritech had its sights on these lands, too. The tension coiled in his chest each time he thought of Kane and the unstoppable wave of corporate greed that threatened to swallow everything. When they finally saw the sign for Redwater, really just a battered wooden plank nailed to a leaning post, Jack Calloway slowed the truck. The hamlet was little more than a main street with a diner, a gas station, and a crumbling motel. A few battered pickups dotted the roadside. Wind moaned through empty alleyways, kicking up dust devils that scattered across the asphalt. It was the kind of place people ended up when they wanted to vanish. They parked outside the diner, the neon coffee cup in the window blinking erratically. Inside, a few locals nursed mugs and stared when Willem and Jack walked in. The two men took a booth near the back. A waitress, lines of exhaustion under her eyes, approached warily. "What can I get you?" she asked, voice low. Willem, trying for a friendly smile, said, "Coffee for both of us. And we're looking for someone." "Maybe you've heard the name Lauren Pike?" Her face stiffened. A flicker of recognition passed before she masked it. "Doesn't ring a bell," she muttered. Then she hurried back behind the counter without pressing for their food orders. Jack met Willem's eyes, a silent conversation passing between them. She definitely knew something. They sipped black coffee in tense silence, scanning the diner. Two older ranchers whispered near the window, eyeing them with half suspicion, half curiosity. A tired-looking man in dusty work clothes kept glancing over from the counter, as if sizing them up. After 10 minutes of uneasy waiting, the waitress returned, setting a single plate of hash browns on the table unasked for. She leaned close and spoke under her breath. "Stop asking about Lauren. You're going to get her killed." Willem's heart thudded. "So she's alive." The waitress darted a look over her shoulder. "Not here, but people are watching. Men in dark SUVs came through a week ago, asking the same questions. Take your coffee and go." Before they could press her further, she hurried away, anxiety clear in the tight set of her jaw. Jack tossed a few bills on the table and they left, stepping back out into the bright midday sun. The dusty street felt ominously deserted. Willem exhaled. "She's been here. She may have already moved on or she's hiding nearby. And we're not the only ones looking." Jack nodded. "Let's be careful. If Westland's men are still around, they'll spot us in minutes." They walked to the gas station next, hoping to catch someone more willing to talk. A teenage attendant was stocking shelves by the main door. Willem bought a soda to justify their presence. As Jack pretended to browse, Willem slipped the attendant a small tip and quietly asked about Lauren. The kid's eyes widened. Lady with dark hair always wore a baseball cap low on her face. She was renting Old Man Larkin's cabin up in the hills. Paid cash, barely said 2 words. "I heard she left a while back, or got spooked." Willem's pulse quickened. "Where's Larkin's place?" A shrug. "Follow the dirt road behind the motel until it forks near the ridge. Take the left path. No sign or anything, but you'll see a battered mailbox with Larkin's name." Jack joined them, handing over exact change for some chips. "Thanks, kid. You've been a big help." The attendant looked as though he wanted to vanish, but nodded and went back to stacking shelves. Outside, Willem and Jack exchanged determined glances. They were onto something. They climbed into the truck and followed the directions, leaving Redwater behind. The paved road gave way to rutted dirt, winding through a patchy pine forest. No other vehicles were in sight. "This is either a huge break," Willem said, gripping the wheel, "or a trap." Jack checked the loaded revolver in his bag. Given Kane's reach, it could be both. Eventually, they came to a fork. True to the kid's word, a leaning mailbox read Larkin in peeling letters. They turned left, climbing steadily into the hills. The thickening tree cover cast flickering shadows across the hood. Then, in a small clearing, they spotted a cabin, small, single story with a sagging porch. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. Willem parked. They stepped out, scanning the area. Birds chirped in the distance, otherwise it was silent. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. Jack motioned for Willem to wait, then crept forward, pushing the door gently with his foot. The inside was dim and smelled faintly of old coffee. Dust motes hung in the air. A single cot in one corner, a wooden table with scattered papers in another. Whoever stayed here had left in a hurry. The place felt abandoned. Jack flicked on a flashlight he kept in his bag, illuminating footprints in the dust. On the table lay an unopened can of food and a notepad with jotted sketches of farmland borders, some sort of rough diagrams of land parcels. Westland's name was scribbled in the margins. Willem ran a hand over the paper. This might be hers. Jack lifted a corner of the notepad, revealing a folded slip of paper. He opened it carefully. An address scrawled in hurried pencil, no city name, just a road marker, mile 78 near Birch Creek. Underneath, a short message read, "Too close. Gotta move." Willem guessed it was Lauren's handwriting. Before they could process further, a crunch of gravel outside caught their attention. Willem peered through a dusty window. A dark SUV was rolling into the clearing, headlights off, as if trying not to be noticed. 2 men emerged, one tall with military posture, the other stockier but just as poised. Both carried sidearms. Jack's voice dropped to a whisper. Kane's men. They slipped away from the window, hearts pounding. They had little time to react. If these men were professionals, they'd sweep the cabin methodically. Willem signaled Jack toward the back door, hidden behind a torn curtain. They moved quietly, stepping outside just as the intruders pushed open the front. Willem and Jack pressed against the cabin's exterior, hearing boots on creaking floorboards. One man said, "No sign of her. Maybe we missed her again. Check the table." A moment later, she left some papers. "Get them." Willem motioned for Jack to move toward the truck, creeping around the side. But the second man caught a glimpse of them through the window. He shouted, "Hey!" In an instant, the cabin door burst open. The tall man raised his gun, but Jack was faster. He fired a single shot that forced both intruders to dive for cover behind the porch railing. "Run!" Jack hissed. They sprinted for their truck, dirt flying under their boots. Bullets whizzed past, splintering a post. Willem threw himself into the driver's seat and turned the key. Jack leapt in beside him. A second later, the engine roared to life, and they tore off down the trail. The SUV started up behind them, sending a plume of gravel and dust skyward. Branches slapped against the sides of the truck as they sped through the narrow forest path. Jack reloaded, jaw clenched. "They're not letting us leave peacefully." Willem pressed the accelerator to the floor. The trail wound sharply, each turn threatening to send them skidding into the pines. The SUV behind kept pace, headlights flashing ominously as it gained ground. Then the road opened onto a steep descent, with a dry wash cutting across. Willem aimed for a narrower path on the right, hoping the bigger vehicle would struggle to follow. Their truck bounced down the embankment, scraping rocks and spitting dust. The SUV tried to follow, but it bottomed out with a metallic crunch. Willem saw it lurch, front wheels grinding. The driver gunned the engine, managing to free it, but precious seconds had been lost. Willem seized the moment, heading for the main road that would take them back toward Redwater. They sped on for miles before Jack finally said, "I don't see them anymore. I think we lost them." His chest heaved with adrenaline. Willem gripped the steering wheel, heart thudding. "Those guys found the cabin the same time we did. Lauren must be on the move. That address, mile 78 near Birch Creek, could be her next hideout." Jack nodded. "We can't go back to Redwater. They'll be looking for us there. Let's find Birch Creek." He smoothed the slip of paper with the address. "Then we pray she's still in one piece." They drove another hour, consulting a battered Wyoming map Jack found in the glove compartment. Birch Creek was in a remote region, mostly national forest with a few private lots. The sun dipped lower, bathing the hills in gold. Willem felt a weight pressing on him. If they failed to find Lauren before Westland's men did, their entire fight might be lost. At mile 78 along a lonely highway, they spotted a rutted turnoff leading toward deeper woods. No signs indicated property lines. After a few hundred yards, the track ended at a small clearing beside a meandering creek. There, half hidden by trees, stood another cabin, this one more worn than the first, with a tarp over part of the roof. They parked a short distance away. No SUV in sight. Quietly they approached, guns drawn, nerves taut. A flicker of movement in the cabin window caught Willem's eye. He raised a hand to signal caution. Jack edged forward, calling out softly, "Lauren Pike? We're not with Westland. We want to talk." A tense silence followed. Then the cabin door opened a crack. Willem glimpsed a slim figure, hair pulled back in a messy bun. She held a shotgun aimed at them. "Stay where you are," the woman commanded, voice trembling with controlled fear. Willem lowered his weapon, showing open palms. "Lauren, my name is Willem Dafoe. This is Jack Calloway. We know about Westland Agritech. We're on your side." She hesitated, eyes darting to the tree line. After a moment, she said, "Close the door behind you. Don't make any sudden moves." They complied, stepping into the dim interior. The place smelled of musty blankets and damp wood. Maps and documents were scattered across a table lit by a single lantern. Lauren kept the shotgun pointed until she locked the door. Then she exhaled shakily and lowered it. "You have no idea how dangerous it is for me to talk to you," she said, voice tight. "Kane's men are everywhere." Jack nodded. "We ran into them at your previous cabin. Almost ended badly. But we need your help. People are losing their farms. We believe you have evidence of Westland's illegal practices." Lauren swallowed hard, glancing at the papers on the table. "I do. I collected it before I left. Emails, purchase records, proof they used shell companies to force false foreclosures and pressure banks. But the moment I tried going public, my life became a nightmare. I've been on the run for 2 years." Willem took a careful step closer. "Jack's an attorney. I'm a farmer they're trying to ruin. We have a network of other farmers, local media that's starting to pay attention. If you testify, if you show the world what you've got, we can blow Westland wide open." She let out a bitter laugh. "I tried trusting the system once. Kane has judges and politicians in his pocket. How do I know you're any different?" Jack held out a card with his legal credentials. "We're small time compared to Westland's empire, but we're honest. Once your evidence is public, it's out of Kane's hands. Federal investigators, real journalists, someone will latch on. He can't buy everyone." Lauren stared at the lantern's flickering flame. Her face showed raw fear and fatigue. "If I do this, I'll need protection. I'm not naive enough to think they won't come after me." Willem nodded firmly. "We'll keep you safe, but we have to move fast. They found your last hideout. They'll figure out this one soon." She looked to the battered duffel bag by the table. "I've got everything on a flash drive, plus paper records. That's all that matters. The rest I can leave behind." Jack extended a hand gently. "We can head back to Montana, get you in front of a federal contact I know in Billings. Then we go public. Kane won't be able to hush it up if it's already out there." Lauren tightened her grip on the shotgun. For a few heartbeats, Willem thought she might refuse. Then she gave a small, resolute nod. "All right, let's do it." They started gathering her documents. A fleeting sense of relief ignited in Willem's chest. This was the evidence that could dismantle Kane's entire operation. But the danger was immediate. As they packed up, Jack stood watch by the window. "We can't go back the same way. Let's take the old forest roads, avoid the main highway until we're closer to Billings." Lauren slung the duffel over her shoulder. "Fine by me, I just want out of here before—" Her words died as the faint sound of engines cut through the evening silence. Willem's heart seized. Peering outside, he saw not one but two dark SUVs pulling up just beyond the clearing, headlights cutting across the cabin's walls. Voices shouted. Doors slammed. In seconds, footsteps pounded through the brush. "Too late," Jack growled. "They found us." Lauren's face went pale, but her eyes steeled. "We'll have to fight our way out," she said, raising the shotgun. Willem checked his own weapon. "We have a truck parked a bit down the trail. If we can get there, we have a chance." Jack peeked out the corner window. "They're spreading out. Probably a dozen men, well armed." Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the cabin's walls, shattering a window. Lauren dove behind an old dresser. Willem and Jack crouched behind a makeshift table, returning fire. The men outside fanned out in the trees, muzzle flashes lighting the dusk. Every shot hammered home the reality. If Westland's enforcers captured them, they'd vanish like so many others before. Willem signaled Lauren, pointing to the back corner. She darted to a side window, fired a shotgun blast that forced two attackers to hit the dirt. Jack emptied his revolver, reloading with trembling hands. A bullet tore through a lantern, throwing sparks and sending the cabin into semi-darkness. "We can't hold out in here," Willem shouted. "We'll burn or get flanked." Lauren nodded, face slick with sweat. "Out the back. That path leads toward your truck." They crawled to the rear door, the old wood splintering from fresh impacts. One attacker tried to circle around, but Lauren's shotgun barked, and he dropped. Willem kicked the back door open, scanning the tree line. Clear for the moment. He waved them forward. They sprinted into the gathering night, hearts pounding, ears ringing from the firefight. Behind them, the cabin lit up with muzzle flashes as the attackers realized they were escaping. Shouts and curses rang out. Willem returned a few shots to keep heads down, while Jack guided Lauren along the narrow path. Branches whipped their faces, the forest floor uneven, but adrenaline propelled them forward. Then Willem heard the pounding of boots behind them. A tall figure lunged from behind a pine, tackling him to the ground. The man pinned Willem's arms with surprising strength, a knife glinting in his hand. Willem twisted, driving a knee upward, fighting for breath. The man's blade slashed, grazing Willem's shoulder. Pain flared, but he managed to slam the attacker's wrist against a tree root, dislodging the knife. With a desperate pivot, Willem rolled him off and delivered a stunning punch to the jaw. Jack doubled back, firing once to drive away another assailant. He helped Willem to his feet. "You all right?" Willem, shoulder throbbing, nodded. "Keep moving." They caught up to Lauren, who had reached the truck. She fumbled with the door latch, thrown by panic. Bullets cracked overhead, some pinging off the metal fender. Jack shouted, "Get in! Get in!" Lauren slid into the back seat and Jack took the passenger side, returning gunfire with each turn of his head. Willem threw himself behind the wheel, blood soaking part of his sleeve, and revved the engine. The truck lurched forward, headlights slicing through the trees. In the rear view, he saw flashlights bobbing as the men tried to give chase, but they had no vehicles close enough to stop them. They bumped along the forest track, each jolt aggravating Willem's shoulder. Jack kept glancing back, ensuring no one was on their tail. Eventually, the forest spat them out onto a service road. The sky had fully darkened by now, and stars glittered coldly overhead. Willem turned onto the highway, tires squealing as he accelerated. Inside the cab, labored breathing and the smell of gunpowder and blood replaced any conversation. Lauren clutched the duffel bag with the documents like it was her lifeline. Jack wiped sweat from his brow, adrenaline still coursing. Willem forced himself to remain steady, focusing on the road. Every moment of that firefight replayed in his head. Lauren spoke first, voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. "That's it. I'm done running. I'll testify. We put all of this out in the open." Jack nodded, checking Willem's wound. "We'll get you patched up, then we head straight to Billings. I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's office. If she sees these documents, Westland can't hush it up." Willem swallowed hard, feeling the warm trickle of blood down his arm. "We do this quick before Kane can reorganize. Let's blow the lid off his entire operation." They drove through the night, stopping only once at a rural clinic, bribing a startled nurse to stitch Willem's shoulder without questions. Dawn found them at the edge of Billings, bleary-eyed but fueled by determination. Jack made calls, setting up an urgent meeting with his federal contact. By midday, they were in a secure office, handing over Lauren's trove of evidence. The next hours blurred. Agents pored over the data, eyes widening at the scope of Westland's wrongdoing, forgeries, fraudulent land surveys, bribed local officials, orchestrated foreclosures. Lauren's statement provided context for every file. By evening, a high-level official visited, telling them an investigation was already underway, spurred by rumors from out-of-state farms. Lauren's testimony could be the final nail in Kane's coffin. Word spread fast. The local media picked up the story, blasting headlines about corporate corruption. Farmers across the county came forward with their own stories, no longer afraid to speak. Kane tried to issue blanket denials, but the evidence was too damning. Within days, the FBI raided Westland's main offices, seizing servers, arresting key executives. Kane himself disappeared for a time, rumored to be holed up in a corporate retreat. 2 weeks later, an arrest warrant was issued for Alexander Kane on charges of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. Even the politicians who had once protected him backed away, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Cameras flashed when agents finally caught Kane at a private airfield, attempting to flee in a chartered jet. Images of him in handcuffs spread like wildfire. For the farmers he'd tormented, it was the closest thing to justice they could imagine. Willem and Jack watched the televised arrest from the farmhouse's living room. Lauren stood nearby, arms crossed. She'd agreed to enter witness protection temporarily, just in case any remnants of Kane's network sought revenge. But for now, she was free to breathe again, her role as whistleblower vindicated. When the news cut to commercial, a hush filled the room. Then Jack let out a shaky laugh. "We did it," he said, almost disbelieving. "It's over." Lauren's eyes glistened, relief flooding her features. Willem, bandage visible under his shirt, nodded, letting out a long exhale. "He's done," Willem murmured. "Westland's empire will crumble without him." Outside, the autumn sun lit the fields. The land seemed to glow with renewed promise. Marta and Billy Ray and many others who had once feared for their farms could now continue without the shadow of corporate tyranny looming over them. For Willem, it wasn't just about saving his own place. It was a reaffirmation that resilience and unity could stand against greed, that even a giant could be toppled when truth saw the light. In the days that followed, the county board canceled the rezoning proposals. Officials who had taken bribes resigned or faced charges. Farmers banded together to form a new cooperative, ensuring a collective voice in local governance. The story of one determined farmer, a down-and-out lawyer, and a frightened whistleblower became local legend, retold at diner counters and in county fairs for years to come. Jack found a renewed sense of purpose in the wake of their victory. He opened a small legal clinic dedicated to helping ordinary people stand up to corporate abuses. Lauren, after giving her final statements, slipped away under protective custody until the trial. Yet she left Willem a note. "Thank you for believing me and risking it all. Some battles are worth fighting. As for Willem, he returned to his daily farm chores with a quieter spirit. Mending fences, feeding livestock, walking the perimeter at sunset, these simple acts now carried the weight of a hard-won freedom. He'd faced powerful forces and prevailed, forging alliances he never expected, discovering courage he didn't know he still possessed. Each morning, he sipped coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over his intact fields, filled with a gratitude that transcended words. When the official trial against Kane began, Willem testified, recounting the intimidation, the bogus legal claims, and the final unraveling of Westland's schemes. His words carried the force of someone who had lived through the attempted destruction of everything he loved and survived. Kane avoided his gaze in the courtroom, expression hollowed by the collapse of his empire. The once impeccable suit now looked like a costume for a broken man. In the end, the jury delivered a guilty verdict on multiple counts. Kane would spend years in federal prison. Reporters asked Willem outside the courthouse how he felt. He shrugged, reflecting on the months of fear and struggle. Relieved, he said simply, but mostly I'm just ready to get back to my farm. And so he did. Under wide Montana skies, he returned to the life he'd built with his own hands, sowing seeds and nurturing life from the soil. No more black SUVs prowled his dirt road. No more county officials arrived with fraudulent citations. His land was truly his again. Neighbors visited for potlucks, new friendships formed, and a sense of community blossomed around the spirit of standing united against any threat. On a cool evening, well after harvest season, Willem sat on his porch beneath a canopy of stars. Oscar dozed at his feet. A gentle breeze rustled the fields, a peaceful lullaby. In that moment, he remembered the distant flash of paparazzi cameras, the artificial glitz of his past life, and felt no longing for it. Here, the only spotlight was the moon, shining over a man who had fought to protect what mattered most: his home. He touched the faint scar on his shoulder, a reminder of the desperate fight in Wyoming's woods. To some, it might seem a small price for such a monumental victory. He thought of all those who had stood by him: Jack, Lauren, Marta, Billy Ray, and felt an immense wave of gratitude. They had proven that, even in a world dominated by powerful corporations and endless legal labyrinths, courage and unity could still win the day. The final echo of this conflict lingered in memory only, a testament to what was possible when one refused to bow. And so the farm stood, green and golden through the seasons, like an enduring testament to resilience. Willem Dafoe, farmer, fighter, and defender of the land, had turned back the tide. Long after the headlines faded and the trial transcripts gathered dust, his fields continued to flourish under a free sky, a quiet homage to the power of truth, conviction, and the unwavering will to never ever give in.